Basically, what we're talking about today is the legacy of Westchester Square. Now, the Westchester Square area has a long and distinguished history. It became the first area of the Bronx that was continuously inhabited by immigrant Europeans when they settled at the head of navigation of Westchester Creek. Why was this area settled in the first place? On June 27, 1654, Thomas Pell met with 5 Indian chiefs to buy all of what is today the eastern half of the Bronx and a portion of eastern Westchester County. 15 men then began their village. Because it was located west of where they came from in Connecticut, and because it had to be a fortified area, they named it Westchester, meaning fortified area to the west. When Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor, discovered that the Englishmen settled there without his permission, he sent a military expedition to the place, rounded up the men, and threw them in jail. Only the desperate pleadings of the women saved the English settlement. Stuyvesant relented and allowed them to live there as long as they followed Dutch law. To emphasize their new allegiance, Stuyvesant insisted that the town be renamed Oostdorp, which means East Town. For the next few years, the inhabitants peacefully herded their cattle on the marsh grass and allowed their pigs to run wild in the woods. Some of them owned horses, others kept bees for making honey. Trees were felled to make room for fields on which peas, onions, grain, and tobacco were planted. Meanwhile, England prepared for a war with the Netherlands. King Charles II granted the New Netherlands to his brother, the Duke of York. In September 1664, the English fleet arrived. This forced the surrender of New Netherlands to the English. The village of Westchester was now part of the Duke's colony of New York. The first thing the new English governor did was to have everyone renew their claims to the lands so that they could be confirmed under English law. In June 1664, Thomas Pell sold his land west of the Hutchinson River to 2 friends from Fairfield, Connecticut, James Eustace and Philip Pinckney. It was soon known as Eastchester because it was located east of Westchester. In the Bronx, the land included what is now Co-op City and all the land northwest of it to the Bronx River, plus today's city of Mount Vernon and the town of Eastchester in Westchester County. In 1670, representatives of the 2 towns planned a road to connect Westchester to Eastchester. Construction of the Eastchester Road began in 1671. In 1681, the town of Westchester established a tavern and regulated the prices to be charged for different drinks. In those days, a tavern was more than just a place for people to meet and have a good time. It was the social center of the settlement. There, people would discuss public affairs and the happenings of the day. It was the local civic center and a sign of civilization. Rivalry between the 2 towns arose in trying to attract a resident minister. Marriages and baptisms could not be performed without a minister present. The practice grew up, get this, for couples to live together and to have children without religious ceremonies. Oh yeah. they shacked up. They would wait until some itinerant minister arrived to conduct services in each of the 2 towns to have the ceremonies performed and move on. In 1683, counties were created in the colony of New York. All of the land that is now in the Bronx, plus all of the land that is in today's Westchester County, became the new county of Westchester. The name of the county came from the largest settlement in the area, the town of Westchester. Since it was the largest settlement, the town of Westchester also was named the county seat. In October 1693, the colonial legislature passed a law establishing 2 parishes in Westchester County. The northern part of the county was in the parish of Rye. The parish of Westchester included both the towns of Westchester and Eastchester, as well as Pelham and Yonkers. Each parish was to pay £50 in country produce to support the minister. The minister was to be hired within 1 year. The way the law was worded, the church administration was structured to be the Church of England, and taxes were to be levied to support the minister. It did not matter that the majority of the residents of Eastchester were really Presbyterians, and the fastest growing sect in Westchester were the Quakers. Because of this, residents of the parish met and chose the Puritan Warham Mather for their minister. But Mather was never ordained and never rose above the level of divinity student. At this point, Caleb Heathcote made his influence felt. Heathcote was a merchant who had come from England from a wealthy family. He was intelligent, industrious, tactful, charming, and logical. Very quickly he rose to be a member of the Colonial Governor's Council and was made the colonel in the Westchester County Militia and the presiding judge of the county's criminal court, civil court, and court-martial. Heathcote thus had the power and influence, and that power and influence was felt on several levels. In 1696, using Heathcote's influence, Westchester received a new charter from the royal governor. The charter not only redefined Westchester town's boundaries and the town government, the charter went even further. The town of Westchester was made into a borough with a mayor, 6 aldermen, and 6 common councilmen chosen for 1-year terms. The mayor and 2 aldermen could sit as a mayor's court to try civil cases up to a value of £20 and minor criminal acts. At the time, Westchester was a sparsely populated rural town, and only 2 large cities in the colony, New York and Albany, had these privileges. Even more astounding, Westchester's officials were to be elected. Those in Albany and New York were all appointed by the governor. Moreover, those who were allowed to vote included all inhabitants. Normally, the right to vote was limited by a property qualification. There was no property qualification to vote in the borough elections in Westchester. Moreover, the charter gave Westchester residents the right to elect their own representative to the colonial assembly. This gave Westchester a greater influence in the assembly than the number of its inhabitants would normally permit. About the same time, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, known by its initials as the SPG, was founded in England. It provided some funds to help pay for ministers of the Church of England and for operation of parishes outside of England. One of the newly ordained ministers they supported was John Bartow. In 1702, John Bartow arrived from England to become the rector of the parish of Rye. Heathcote persuaded him and the governor to change that appointment to the parish of Westchester. Thus, John Bartow, an ordained minister of the Church of England, set up residence in the town of Westchester. It was about then that the first burials took place in the church graveyard. When he first arrived, Bartow faced certain problems because of the primitive state of the area. Excuse me. Queen Anne, as the head of the Church of England, had set aside 100 acres for the use of the parish. But Bartow found that it was all wilderness land. He also lacked a Bible for the church and a Book of Common Prayer for services. He had to ask the SPG in London to provide them. Until a parish church could be erected, Services were conducted in the town hall, or as it was called, the meeting house. Work on the church proceeded very slowly. A ship carrying some of the church's ornaments was lost at sea. In 1705, Bartow ordered new books from London to establish a parish library, which he did not receive until 1708. In 1706, Queen Anne, as head of the Church of England, presented the congregation a communion service consisting of a chalice, a paten, a communion table, a Bible, a book of common prayer, a book of homilies, and a silk pulpit cloth. The church still has them today. The small church that was finally finished in 1711 was made of wood. It was square in shape, 28 feet on each side, rising 18 feet high to the eaves, surmounted by a roof in the form of a pyramid, topped by a bell turret. Lewis Morris of Morrisania, who was the Chief Justice of the colony, and who later was appointed the first royal governor of New Jersey, donated the bell. Reverend Bartow, however, noted that very few people attended services. At Christmas and Easter, he attracted anywhere from 8 to 17 communicants. His collection plate rarely achieved a single pound in donated funds. A number of American Indians and blacks came to services, but they usually avoided baptism. In 1710, he did baptize a free black man and 3 black children and a black woman servant. His congregation was generally young, since most of the elderly refused to come to services, but allowed their children to go. Soon after his arrival, Bartow established a class in the church to teach children the catechism. Classes were held at night to teach adults. Bartow enlisted Caleb Heathcote and Lewis Morris to try to obtain funds from the SPG and from the Colonial Assembly for a permanent schoolmaster. By 1711, the parish had one. The teacher's salary was paid in part by the SPG and in part from charging tuition. Yeah, go on and sit down.
Thank you.
Relax, enjoy life. After John Bartow's death, the SBG assigned the Reverend Thomas Standard to be the new rector at Westchester. He was inducted as rector in 1726. Frankly, he did not like the attitude of the Westchester residents. He was offended greatly by the egalitarian manners of the Quakers in Westchester. Oh, terrible. In fact, the Quakers had built their own meeting house just to the south of the church. According to the Quaker practices of the day, when anyone was buried in the Quaker churchyard, no headstone was erected at the gravesite. Although the old colonial meeting house is long since gone, the Quaker burial ground still remains just south of today's St. Peter's Church. It looks very much like a clean, mowed lawn. About the same time, the SPG paid the cost of erecting a new school and paying some of the salary of the schoolmaster. Because most children were kept at home to help their parents run the family farm, not too many children attended classes regularly. It was also true that the majority of the Westchester inhabitants were not adherents of the Church of England. Standard estimated that only 3 or 4 families were devoted to the Anglican Church, but he had 30 communicants. He was able to attract 100 people to his services in summer, but only 50 in winter. I think they were frozen out. He also had difficulty attracting blacks to the church, but he managed to baptize 1 or 2 every year. Meanwhile, the town of Westchester expanded from its agricultural base. Land was set aside for a sheep pasture. The wool provided by the sheep was processed into coarse woolen cloth. As a result, several weavers migrated to the town, setting up looms inside their own homes. The cloth was sold, along with livestock and agricultural produce, at the weekly market held in the center of town, close to the church, and at the county fairs held at Westchester twice a year. Regular shipments of goods purchased from New York City came up Westchester Creek twice a week by ship to the town dock. Some of the stevedores who worked in the town dock were free black men. The first Irish Catholic, and indeed the first Catholic of any kind, arrived in 1744 in the town of Westchester. His name was Charles McDaniel, and he was a weaver. When McDaniel arrived, the residents were very wary of him. For centuries there had been conflict in Europe between Catholics and Protestants. It was decided that all McDaniel had to do was to go to court and swear allegiance to the king, and he would be permitted to stay. McDaniel did so, and thus became the first Irish Catholic to reside in the Bronx. The town of Westchester remained the county seat until the courthouse near today's Westchester Square burned down. This was a blow to the importance of the town because the need for building a new courthouse led to the removal of the county seat to White Plains in 1760. When Rector Thomas Stander died in 1760, the SPG appointed John Milner to take his place. Milner was a New Yorker who was in London to become a minister. He was inducted into his office in 1761. Milner was a young man determined to make a successful record to impress the leaders of the SPG in London. In 1762, St. Peter's Church received a new charter issued in the name of the king who had just recently ascended the throne, George III. With funds raised by the new corporation, in 1763, a 30-acre glebe was purchased for the rector not far from the church. Milner gladly accepted the donation. Milner used his own money, spending £200 to repair the parsonage, erect a barn, and other farm structures. As a young man, Milner also showed great energy in compiling a good record. The number of communicants increased greatly. So did the number of baptisms, including a number of adults and of blacks. While the parish was pleased with Milner, they refused to reimburse him for the money he spent for improving his glebe. Incensed, in 1765, Milner left the parish in a huff and became the minister at a parish in Newport, Virginia. Milner's successor was Samuel Seabury, who had been born in Connecticut. He was inducted into office in 1766. He found that sometimes the people filled the church to overflowing, and sometimes they filled only a few seats. He preached every other Sunday morning in Westchester, holding prayers in the afternoon and catechizing a class of about 10 pupils after that. Several more pupils attended the session just to listen. He had only 22 communicants. Seabury, however, faced financial problems. The SPG withdrew its subsidy completely. He had to depend on the salary the colonial legislature provided and whatever fees he could collect. No one paid burial fees, and newlyweds avoided marriage fees by having the ceremony performed by the Presbyterian minister at Rye. Desperate, he tried to rent out his glebe, but had to spend funds putting the parsonage and the fences in order. Seabury's arrival coincided with the agitation developing in the colonies against the attempt by the British government to impose taxes on Americans to help pay for the cost of the recently ended French and Indian War. To try to get the British government to repeal the tax on tea, the First Continental Congress imposed an embargo on importing British goods. Many in the town in Westchester thought that this measure was highly destructive to the local farmers. The Reverend Samuel Seabury thought so too. Seabury then wrote a widely read pamphlet called free thoughts on the proceedings of the Continental Congress and signed it A.W. Farmer, or a Westchester farmer. In it, Seabury used biting ridicule to make points against the actions of the Congress. It was so effective that another pamphlet to answer it was written by a young college student in New York City named Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. I don't know if you ever heard of him. When fighting broke out in the American Revolution, the British eventually invaded New York. They attempted to trap George Washington and his army encamped in northern Manhattan and the western Bronx by landing at Throg's Neck, marching across the Bronx, cut off any retreat, capture him and his army, and end the revolt. To stop that from happening, in October 1776, Colonel Edward Hand and his Delaware riflemen were stationed on the west bank of Westchester Creek at the end of a wooden causeway where Tremont Avenue is today. The men were protected by a range of cordwood and a mill on the west bank of the creek. The men were instructed to pull up the planks of the bridge that crossed Westchester Creek if the British advanced that way, and to set fire to the mill if it was necessary. On October 12, 1776, a British fleet of 80 or 90 ships landed at Throg's Neck, and an army of red-coated British regulars marched across the causeway to the center of the town of Westchester. The Delaware Continentals ripped up the planks of the bridge as instructed and shot at the redcoats with deadly accuracy from behind the cordwood and from the heights of the mill. That forced the British to retreat back to the neck. Thus, Washington escaped from the trap by retreating to White Plains and lived to continue the American Revolution. In November of 1776, Samuel Seabury returned to the scene of the Battle of Westchester and was appalled at the level of destruction. He saw the whole town destroyed, and he felt he could no longer continue his ministry there. Instead, he volunteered to be the chaplain of the Tory troops, Americans who fought on the British side. For the rest of the Revolutionary War, the town of Westchester remained in British hands. The local government was suspended. No services were held in the ruined church. No minister resided there to look after the spiritual needs of the people. Countless Tory refugee families from northern Westchester County were settled in the town. They were subjected to constant raids by irregular militia troops, seeking out any Tory soldiers and any military supplies and food that they could use. They terrorized the population through beating anyone who opposed them and threatening people with death if they did not cooperate. The British finally evacuated the town of Westchester following the end of the war in 1783. All of the Tories were ordered exiled by the new New York State government. They left for either England or Nova Scotia. As a prominent Tory, Samuel Seabury knew he could not return to his parish, but he knew that his beloved church now faced a crisis. There was no American bishop. Seabury knew that the church could never continue unless an American bishop were consecrated. He determined that he would be the one. Seabury set sail for England, but no bishop there would consecrate him unless he swore allegiance to the king as the head of the church. This Seabury would not do. He then journeyed north to Scotland and was consecrated by the non-juring bishops there, who did not have to swear such an oath to assure the supremacy of the king and the church. When Samuel Seabury returned as the first bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church of America, he established himself in his native Connecticut. In Seabury's old parish of Westchester, the church remained in ruins. For years there was no rector to lead the flock. Because the ties between the church and government were now severed, neither the state nor the town could contribute funds for the repair of St. Peter's Church or for the upkeep of a minister. The parishioners would have to do it on their own. Thus, no rector was called to serve for several years. Nevertheless, in 1795, the parishioners rebuilt the church. It was still made of wood and resembled the original church, but was slightly larger. They also called Isaac Wilkins to be their new rector. Wilkins had once owned a 200-acre farm called Castle Hill.
Oh,
He served many years in the Colonial Assembly as the representative of the borough of Westchester. During the American Revolution, he was a staunch supporter of Samuel Seabury and was a prominent Tory. As such, his land was confiscated by New York State, and he was exiled to Nova Scotia after the war ended. However, by the 1790s, the rancor against the Tories had abated, and he was allowed to return. He was not a clergyman, however. Thus, before he came back, he took holy orders in Nova Scotia. While he was a rector, a private corporation built a toll road passing in front of the church. Since it led to the town of Westchester, it was called the Westchester Turnpike. This road is Westchester Avenue today. Although the village of Westchester was the largest of all the villages in what is today the Bronx, in 1846 the town still remained a farming community and not much disturbed the peace. It was in 1851 that Isaac Butler, a carpenter who emigrated from England, came to live in the town of Westchester. He was appointed the church's sexton. As a carpenter, he made minor repairs to the church, rang the bells, and dug the graves. He eventually served as a vestryman and as the parish treasurer. Grave digging led to his becoming the local undertaker, operating a funeral home across from the church on Westchester Avenue. Isaac Butler died in 1913. The funeral home bearing his name continued into the 20th century, run by his son and grandson. By the 1850s, a number of wealthy industrialists and merchants fled the overcrowded and increasingly polluted New York City and built mansions along Long Island Sound and Throgs Neck. There they enjoyed the clean air and the countryside. They also joined the parish of St. Peter's. They became important to the parish when disaster struck in the early 1850s. The wooden church caught fire and burned down. The wealth of the new parishioners meant that the parish could now pay the cost of an impressive stone structure to replace it. The parish hired Leopold Eidlitz as the architect of the new church. Eidlitz had been born in Prague in the old Austrian Empire and was ethnically a Czech. He was a prominent architect in New York City. He was later to design some major structures in Manhattan. For the parish, he created a structure designed in the Gothic Revival style. Eidlitz passionately believed that this style was perfect for beautiful and significant buildings. He made St. Peter's the dominant feature of the neighborhood, with steeply pitched roofs, a bold profile, and a towering spire. It was completed in 1856. Eidlitz was hired again about 10 years later to design a nearby building to serve as a Sunday school for the parish. Originally called St. Peter's Chapel, it is now called Foster Hall. Built from 1867 to 1868, the one-story structure is also designed in Victorian Gothic style, uses similar materials as the church, and has several picturesque elements. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, another fire broke out in the church, destroying some parts of it. Because Leopold Eidlitz was heavily engaged in designing parts of the New York State Capitol building in Albany, his son, Cyrus Lozelle Warner Eidlitz, was hired in his place. St. Peter's was his first independent work. He later went on to design some other important buildings, including the original Times Tower on Times Square in Manhattan. The younger Eidlitz tried to keep the architectural integrity of his father's work, but did make some changes. The rebuilt spire, for instance, followed the original design, but he increased the height of the transepts and added the clerestory. The reconstruction was completed in 1879. While work on the church commenced and continued, the Civil War approached. In the town of Westchester, on a site east of Westchester Creek, along modern Tremont Avenue, stood Harrington Boarding School for Boys. The principal was Brainard Timothy Harrington, a rabid abolitionist. With the outbreak of the war, he dressed his pupils in military uniform, provided them with rifles, and gave them military training on school grounds. After war had broken out in 1863, riots broke out in New York City and Manhattan Island against the newly enacted draft law. The law enabled any draftee to avoid service by paying $300 to the government so that a substitute could be hired to take his place. However, many poor people could never afford to pay $300. On the second day of the draft riots in New York, the violence spread to the mainland. Mobs broke into the draft offices in Morrisania and West Farms and destroyed the draft lists. Brainard Timothy Harrington, however, was concerned that the rioters in the western part of the Bronx would cross the Bronx River and harm him and burn down his boys' boarding school. He had got a dozen of his older uniformed pupils to stand guard with their rifles. He also recruited some of his adult neighbors to join in the effort. After a look, the rioters beat a hasty retreat. After the war ended in 1865, the area around Westchester Square was changed. The population slowly increased. A new town hall was built in the northwestern corner of Westchester Square. The center of Westchester Square was filled with wooden homes and shops. The town decided to widen Westchester Avenue. In 1882, a building on the south side of Westchester Square, near Westchester Avenue, designed by the New York architect Frederick Clark Withers, was erected according to the will of wealthy Throgs Neck resident Peter Van Schaik. It was meant to house a privately run library for use by working men. The town, however, refused to appropriate any money to purchase books for it. In 1890, Collis P. Huntington, who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad and owned several railroads around the country, and who was another Throgs Neck resident, donated the funds to provide books for it and to erect an addition designed by William Anderson to house a billiard room. Today it is known as the Huntington Free Library and Reading Room. In 1895, the town of Westchester was taken over by New York City. The old town hall first became a local police precinct, then the site for a municipal court building. In 1898, when the 5 boroughs were created, the area became part of the new borough of the Bronx. By the early 20th century, more changes were made. The streets were paved, and by 1920, the elevated portion of the Lexington Avenue local subway line was completed above Westchester Avenue with a stop at Westchester Square. The coming of the subway to the area attracted more people. Developers erected homes to accommodate them. Farms were sold, and the wealthy residents sold their increasingly valuable land and moved northward to Westchester County. The new residents were now more middle class. From the period of annexation onward, the area in and around Westchester Square became more commercial. At first, local farmers trekked there from outlying areas to sell their produce. Other residents from all over flocked to the square to do their weekly shopping. With the coming of the subway, banks, commercial shops, and professional offices opened their doors. Schools were erected a short distance away. The center of the square became a park. With all these changes, modern Westchester Square emerged. But what is the legacy of Westchester Square? That location has given much to the heritage of the locality and to the Bronx at large. Westchester Square is the place where the first permanent settlement of the Bronx occurred. It is the place where the first religious parish of any kind was established. It is the first place where the first school opened. It is the place where the most democratic government in the world in the 17th and 18th centuries was conducted. It is the place where tolerance and acceptance of the other was first practiced in the Bronx. It is the place where a Revolutionary War battle helped save George Washington and his Continental Army from entrapment and enabled him to continue fighting the war until the independence of the United States was achieved. It is the place where one of the first libraries for the use of the public was opened. It is the place that became the focus of civic, commercial, and cultural life of the area. And it is the place where two historic landmark structures, St. Peter's Episcopal Church and the Huntington Free Library, can be found. In all, it is a legacy to be cherished and celebrated. Thank you very much. I will entertain any questions, but I must warn you, I don't sing or dance very well.